April 15th, 1945, 2,200 hours. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici stood in his command post, less than 70 kilometers east of Berlin. The air in the bunker was thick with cigarette smoke and suppressed fear. He was staring at a situation map where the red Soviet arrows were no longer just tactical indicators. They were a colossal death sentence waiting to be executed. Across the Oder River, at the Kustrin bridgehead, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had assembled the most terrifying force in the history of human warfare to deliver the final blow to the heart of the Reich. The numbers his intelligence officer had just updated were not warfare, they were industrial destruction. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and most terrifying of all, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars. Heinrici, known as the Poison Dwarf for his small stature and prickly nature, understood the meaning of those numbers better than anyone. He was the Reich's last master of defense, a man who had held the line against waves of Soviet infantry for years, using cunning rather than brute strength. But tonight, the mathematics were conspiring against him. The ratio wasn't 3-1 or 5-1. At key breakthrough sectors, it was 20 Soviet guns for every single German gun. The silence outside the bunker was a lie. Heinrici knew exactly what was waiting. Sound-ranging reports and captured prisoners confirmed that Zhukov did not intend to attack in the conventional manner. He intended to erase the Seelow Heights from the face of the earth before committing his infantry. A firestorm, a moving wall of steel that would grind the German first line of defense into fine dust in less than 30 minutes. The problem wasn't courage. His men, a desperate mix of old veterans, Hitler Youth, and remnant SS units, were ready to fight. The problem was position. According to the standard military doctrine of Hitler and the General Staff, German forces had to hold the first defensive line, the Hauptkampflinie, right at the riverbank to stop the enemy from crossing. But Heinrici looked at the map and saw a death trap. If he followed doctrine, if he left his army sitting in those forward trenches, they would evaporate. Not metaphorically, but literally. Zhukov's 40,000 guns would turn the first trench line into a massive collective grave before the first German soldier could even pull a trigger. Time was running out. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble slightly, not from bombs, but from the idling engines of thousands of T-34 tanks across the river, preparing for the race to Berlin. Heinrici checked his watch. Relying on a lifetime of experience on the Eastern Front, he could feel the moment approaching. The enemy would not wait for dawn. They would attack, while darkness still provided cover. A single question haunted the old general's mind. When? When would Zhukov order the barrage? If Heinrici withdrew too early, the Soviets would realize it and catch the Germans moving in the open. If he withdrew too late, even by 5 minutes, the entire Ninth Army would be crushed in place. He needed a moment of absolute precision, and he had to make that decision right now, in defiance of the frantic orders against retreat coming from Berlin. The phone in the bunker rang. It was a forward observer from the 309th Infantry Division. He reported a subtle shift in the wind and the distinct, metallic clanking of thousands of tank treads grinding against the earth across the river. The Soviets were not just idling anymore, they were forming up. Heinrici closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the battlefield map in his mind. He knew Zhukov's playbook. The Russian marshal favored the sledgehammer over the scalpel. He would not probe. He would annihilate. At 1:50 hours, Heinrici made his move. He did not ask for permission from Berlin. He did not consult the OKW. He picked up the receiver and spoke 2 words that would save the Ninth Army. Begin, Hagen. The Hagen movement was a tactical masterstroke born of desperation. It was a withdrawal, yes, but it was a withdrawal executed with the precision of a Swiss watch. Under the cover of total darkness, thousands of German soldiers quietly climbed out of their forward foxholes. They grabbed their MG-42s, their Panzerfausts, and their ammunition crates. They moved like ghosts, retreating 2 kilometers back, up the steep slopes of the Seelow Heights, to the second defensive line, known as the Großkampflinie. They left behind a skeleton crew, a few hundred men to fire flares, and keep up the pretense that the main force was still there. For the next hour, the German front line was essentially a hollow shell, a Hollywood set designed to deceive the Red Army's artillery spotters. The tension during the retreat was agonizing. If the Soviet searchlights turned on now, if a single flare illuminated the withdrawal, the Ninth Army would be caught in the open, exposed and defenseless. But the darkness held. By 2:45 hours, the last of the main infantry units had slipped into the hardened bunkers on the high ground. They waited, rifles trained on the empty trenches they had just abandoned. Then, at 3 hours, the world ended. It began with a flash that bleached the night sky white, followed instantly by a sound that no human ear was designed to withstand. 40,000 Soviet guns fired simultaneously. The earth didn't just shake, it liquefied. For 35 minutes, the forward trenches, the positions Heinrici's men had occupied less than an hour ago, were subjected to the most intense artillery bombardment in the history of warfare. The ground was churned, flipped, and pulverized. Steel rained down at a density that defied physics. Trees were splintered into toothpicks, bunkers were turned inside out. If the German army had been there, as Hitler had ordered, they would have ceased to exist as a biological entity. From his command post on the heights, Heinrici watched the destruction of his former positions with grim satisfaction. He was watching a multi-million-ton sledgehammer strike an empty pillow. Zhukov was expending countless tons of ammunition to kill dirt. When the barrage finally lifted, a strange, suffocating silence returned for a heartbeat. Then, Zhukov played his second card. 140 huge anti-aircraft searchlights snapped on, aiming directly at the German lines. The plan was to blind the defenders, but in the thick smoke and dust kicked up by the bombardment, the light diffused, creating a blinding white wall that obscured the vision of the attacking Soviet tank drivers and infantry. They were blinded by their own brilliance. The Soviet First Belarusian Front surged forward, expecting to walk over the corpses of the German defenders. Instead, they found a moonscape of empty craters. Confused but pressed by their officers, they pushed on, wading through the swampy ground of the Oder, straight toward the steep slopes of the heights. And that was when the trap snapped shut. From the high ground, unaffected by the bombardment and fully dug in, Heinrici's men opened fire. The 88mm flak guns, depressed to fire horizontally, tore through the thin armor of the T-34 seconds, struggling in the mud. The MG-42s, with their terrifying rate of fire, cut down the waves of infantry, silhouetted against the blinding searchlights. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Heinrici had traded 2 kilometers of dirt for the survival of his army, and in doing so, he had turned Zhukov's masterpiece of destruction into a logistical nightmare. By mid-morning, the valley of the Oder had transformed from a battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The Oderbruch, the swampy floodplain leading up to the heights, was choking on its own congestion. Zhukov's plan relied on speed and shock, but Heinrici had removed the shock, and the terrain had killed the speed. The Soviet infantry, disoriented by the searchlights and hammered by German artillery from the high ground, were pinned down in the mud. They were dying in the thousands, unable to move forward, unable to retreat. In his command post, Marshal Zhukov was losing his composure. The strict timetable he had promised Stalin was disintegrating by the minute. The plan called for the Seelow Heights to be taken before noon. It was now approaching midday, and his forces had barely advanced past the empty German decoy trenches. Furious and under immense pressure from Moscow, Zhukov made a decision that would turn a tactical failure into a logistical catastrophe. He abandoned the original plan. He ordered his 2 reserve tank armies, the 1st and the 2nd Guards tank armies, to enter the battle immediately. This was a violation of basic military logic. These tanks were the exploitation force, meant to race to Berlin after the infantry had punched a hole in the line. By throwing them in now, while the breach had not yet been made, Zhukov created one of the greatest traffic jams in military history. Thousands of T-34 seconds and heavy IS-2 tanks roared into the narrow, swampy roads already clogged with stalled infantry, supply trucks, and horse-drawn artillery. From his observation post, Heinrici watched the chaos unfold with cold professional detachment. He saw the Soviet armor bunching up, bumper to bumper, their tracks spinning uselessly in the marshland. They were sitting ducks. The German 88mm crews on the ridge didn't even have to aim carefully. They simply fired into the mass of steel below. Every shell found a target. Turrets were blown sky-high. Burning tanks blocked the paths for those behind them, trapping entire brigades in the kill zone. The Luftwaffe, though a shadow of its former self, scraped together its last operational Stukas and Fokker-Wulfs to strafe the paralyzed columns. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of exploding ammunition, screaming engines, and the relentless tearing sound of MG-42s. The system of the Red Army, usually an unstoppable steamroller, had jammed its own gears. Heinrici had turned the Red Army's greatest strength, its overwhelming numbers, into its greatest weakness. There was simply no room to maneuver. The Soviet commanders were trying to push an ocean through a garden hose, but Heinrici remained a realist. He knew this victory was temporary. He was buying time with blood and iron, but the sheer weight of the enemy was inexhaustible. His ammunition was finite, his barrels were overheating, and while he had stopped the first wave, the horizon was still dark, with the smoke of thousands more tanks waiting their turn. He had humiliated Zhukov and defied the odds, but the clock was still ticking. The Ninth Army was fighting like a cornered wolf, inflicting horrific damage. Yet every German soldier lost was irreplaceable, while the Soviets simply climbed over their own dead to inch forward. The battle of maneuver was over. The battle of attrition had begun. Night fell over the Seelow Heights, but there was no darkness. The entire eastern horizon was glowing red from burning tanks, burning villages, and the relentless muzzle flashes of artillery that refused to cease. April 16th had ended not with a Soviet breakthrough, but with a Soviet disaster. Yet, in the Kremlin, patience had run out. That night, a secure telephone line rang in Zhukov's headquarters. It was Stalin. The voice on the other end was quiet, cold, and threatening. Stalin informed Zhukov that Marshal Koniev, commanding the front to the south, was making excellent progress and was now being given permission to turn his tanks north toward Berlin. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Stalin was pitting his two greatest marshals against each other in a race for the prize. For Zhukov, this was not just a military setback. It was a potential career-ending humiliation. The fear of Stalin accomplished what the German resistance could not. It stripped away all tactical caution. On the morning of April 17th, Zhukov abandoned any pretense of strategy. He ordered his commanders to simply brute force their way up the slopes. It was the tyranny of numbers in its rawest form. On the German side, Heinrici was fighting a different kind of war. He wasn't just fighting the Russians. He was fighting the delusions of his own leadership in Berlin. He knew his men were exhausted. They had fired their barrels until the steel warped. They had held the line for 24 hours against the largest army ever assembled, but they were running on adrenaline and fear. To hold the heights for another day, Heinrici needed reserves. He specifically needed the experienced panzer divisions, the Müncheberg and the Nordland, that were being held in reserve near Berlin. But when he picked up the phone to demand their release, he hit a wall of political insanity. Hitler and his circle in the Führer bunker were convinced that the attack on Seelow was a feint. They believed the real main blow would come from a different direction, or they wanted to save the tanks for a grandiose, impossible counteroffensive later. For hours, while his front line was being hammered by fresh Soviet waves, Heinrici was forced to argue with men staring at maps in a concrete bunker deep underground, men who had lost all connection with reality. Finally, grudgingly, the reserves were released. But in modern warfare, time is the only currency that matters. The delay meant that these vital panzer units had to move toward the front in broad daylight, under skies now swarming with Soviet Sturmovix. They were strafed and bombed before they could even reach their firing positions. When they finally arrived, they were thrown piecemeal into the inferno, acting as fire brigades rather than a cohesive armored fist. By the afternoon of April 17th, the battle had devolved into a grim arithmetic of attrition. The Hagen movement had saved the army from the opening bombardment, but it could not make them immortal. The sheer weight of Soviet metal was beginning to erode the German positions. For every T-34 the Germans knocked out, 2 more appeared from the smoke. For every Soviet infantryman cut down by an MG-42, 5 more stepped over his body. The defenders were killing the enemy at a ratio that would have broken any other army in history, but the Red Army of 1,945 was a force of nature. It absorbed the punishment and kept moving, driven by the terrifying will of the state behind it. Heinrici watched his map as the blue markers representing his battalions began to thin out. He saw the inevitable cracking of the line. He had outsmarted Zhukov tactically, but he could not outlast the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. The Ghost maneuver had bought them 48 hours of life, but the bill was coming due. The Seelow Heights were no longer a defensive line. They were a meat grinder, and the gears were starting to jam with blood. By the morning of April 18th, the laws of physics finally asserted their dominance over the laws of will. The German line did not snap. It eroded. Like a seawall battered by a hurricane for 3 days straight, the structural integrity of the Ninth Army began to fail. The breakthroughs were small at first, isolated penetrations where a Soviet tank platoon managed to crush a depleted infantry company, or where a defensive bunker finally ran out of ammunition. But in warfare, small cracks in a dam are fatal. Once the water starts flowing, the collapse is inevitable. Zhukov, having brutally spent tens of thousands of his own men to clear the path, finally saw his armor break into the open country beyond the heights. The Seelow position, the last hardened shield protecting Berlin, had been breached. Now, the battlefield shifted from the static hell of trench warfare to a chaotic war of movement. And this was where the German nightmare truly began. The Ninth Army was no longer a cohesive wall. It was being shattered into isolated islands of resistance, fighting back-to-back as the red tide flowed around them. In the Führerbunker, deep beneath the Chancellery Garden in Berlin, the reaction to this collapse was a descent into total delusion. Adolf Hitler, trembling and hunched over his maps, refused to accept the reports Heinrici was sending. To Hitler, the breach at Seelow was a temporary setback. He began issuing orders to units that existed only on paper. He moved flags representing divisions that had been reduced to a few hundred men, speaking of pincer movements and annihilation attacks that would throw the Russians back across the Oder. Heinrici listened to these orders over the telephone with a mixture of disbelief and cold rage. He was a man dealing in blood and earth, while his supreme commander was dealing in fantasy. Hitler declared that the Ninth Army must hold its ground where it stood, and that the city of Frankfurt and der Oder was to be declared a fortress, a Festung. In the lexicon of the late war, Heinrici knew exactly what the word fortress meant. It was a designation that sounded heroic in propaganda broadcasts, but meant coffin in reality. It meant no retreat, no resupply, and inevitable death for every man inside the perimeter. The strategic situation was becoming catastrophic. As Zhukov's tanks raced west toward Berlin, they were not just threatening the capital. They were beginning to curl southward. At the same time, Marshal Koniev's forces, having broken through in the south, were turning north. The jaws of a gigantic trap were closing. The Ninth Army, the bulk of Heinrici's effective fighting force, was in danger of being encircled not in Berlin, but in the forests southeast of the city. They were about to be cut off from the capital they were supposed to defend. Heinrici realized that his mission had changed. It was no longer about stopping the Russians. That was impossible. It was no longer about saving Berlin. The city was doomed. His new, unspoken mission was to save the Ninth Army from total annihilation. He had to extricate them from the trap before the Soviet pincers met. But to do that, he would have to defy Hitler again. He would have to order a retreat from the fortress positions. He would have to abandon the static defense and turn his army into a moving pocket, fighting its way west, not to win, but to reach the Elbe River and surrender to the Americans. The Poison Dwarf was preparing for his final act of insubordination, one that would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the tragedy of the Ninth Army had entered its final, terminal phase. While the Nazi leadership celebrated with tea and cakes in the bunker, deluding themselves with maps that no longer matched reality, General Heinrici was watching his army being strangled. The Soviet pincers had bypassed the Ninth Army's flanks. Zhukov was pushing north of them, Koniev was pushing south of them, and behind them, the gate was slamming shut. 200,000 men, along with thousands of terrified refugees who had fled into the German lines for protection, were being herded into a dense patch of pine forest southeast of Berlin. This was the beginning of the Halby Pocket, a cauldron of death that would become the graveyard of the Ninth Army. The situation was a tactical nightmare. The army was running out of fuel, ammunition, and food. They were surrounded on three sides by the Red Army, which was compressing the pocket hour by hour with relentless artillery fire and airstrikes. The forest floor was turning into a charnel house, with trees splintered by shrapnel and the air thick with the smoke of burning vehicles. In the midst of this catastrophe, Heinrici received a new set of orders from the Führerbunker that were so detached from reality they bordered on insanity. Hitler commanded the Ninth Army not to retreat west to save themselves, but to hold their position and form a static breakwater against the Soviet tide. Even worse, he ordered them to prepare for an attack northward to cut off Zhukov's spearheads and save Berlin. It was an order to commit suicide. To attack north meant turning their exposed flank to Marshal Koniev's tanks. It meant driving straight into the teeth of the strongest army on earth, with empty fuel tanks and exhausted men. Heinrici refused. He saw the map with the clarity of a man who had no illusions left. He realized that Berlin was already lost. Sending the Ninth Army into the capital would not save the city. It would only add 200,000 more corpses to the rubble. The only moral imperative remaining was to save the human beings under his command. He looked west, toward the Elbe River, where the American lines were waiting. The Americans would take prisoners. The Soviets would take revenge. The poisoned dwarf made his decision. He would not order the Ninth Army to Berlin. He would not order them to stand and die in the forest. He began to organize a breakout, but not the one Hitler wanted. He directed General Theodor Busse, the commander of the Ninth Army, inside the pocket, to ignore the orders from the bunker. "Do not go to Berlin," Heinrici urged. "Go west, punch through the encirclement, cross the Autobahn, and get to the 12th Army." The 12th Army, commanded by the young General Walther Wenck, was facing the Americans to the west. Heinrici's plan was a masterpiece of improvisation in the midst of chaos. He wanted Wenck to turn his back on the Americans, who had stopped advancing anyway, and attack east to link up with the Ninth Army. It was a rescue mission, not a military offensive. The goal was to create a corridor through the Soviet Ring of Steel, a narrow passage through which the remnants of the Ninth Army and the civilian refugees could escape the Soviet vengeance. It was a plan that required treason against Hitler to succeed. On April 28th, the collision between military reality and political fantasy finally occurred on a dusty roadside north of Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the OKW and Hitler's most loyal lackey, was driving to the front to personally ensure that the orders to save the Führer were being obeyed. What he found made his blood run cold. He did not see columns of troops marching aggressively toward Berlin to break the Soviet siege. Instead, he saw the roads clogged with exhausted units moving west, away from the capital, organized by Heinrici's staff. Keitel found Heinrici near his command vehicle, studying a map, with the same calm detachment he had worn since the battle began. The confrontation that followed was one of the most dramatic moments of the war's final days. Keitel, his face purple with rage, screamed at the Colonel General, accusing him of cowardice, treason, and sabotage. He demanded to know why the Ninth Army was not attacking toward Berlin as ordered. He waved his field marshal's baton, shouting that Heinrici was defying the Führer himself. Heinrici watched the performance with icy silence. When Keitel finally paused for breath, the poisoned dwarf delivered his response. He did not shout. He pointed a gloved finger toward the smoke rising from the Halby pocket in the distance. He explained the arithmetic of the situation one last time. The Ninth Army was encircled. They had no fuel. They had no heavy ammunition. To order them to turn around and attack into the teeth of Zhukov's army was not a military order. It was a death sentence for 200,000 men. "Marshal Keitel," Heinrici said, his voice cutting through the noise of the retreating columns. "If you want these men to be shot, you will have to do it yourself." It was the ultimate act of insubordination. For a German officer, trained in the Prussian tradition of absolute obedience, to speak this way to a superior was unthinkable. But Heinrici had long since passed the point of caring about his career or his life. He cared only for the arithmetic of survival. Keitel relieved him of command on the spot. He ordered Heinrici to return to his post and await further disciplinary action, effectively firing the only competent defensive commander left in the Third Reich. But it was too late. The gears that Heinrici had set in motion could not be stopped by a field marshal's tantrum. The orders had already gone out to General Busse in the pocket and General Wenck in the west. The plan was active. While Hitler sat in his bunker, moving imaginary flags on a map, believing that General Wenck's 12th Army was coming to save him and the Nazi regime, Wenck was doing exactly what Heinrici had secretly coordinated. Wenck turned his army around, leaving a thin screen against the Americans, and launched a desperate attack eastward. But he wasn't attacking to reach the Chancellery. He was attacking to reach the forest of Halbe. He broadcast a message that rippled through the terrified refugees and soldiers trapped in the pocket. "Hurry up, we are waiting for you." It was a race against time. The Ninth Army, now leaderless in the eyes of the OKW, but guided by the survival instinct Heinrici had instilled, gathered its last remaining strength. They massed their remaining tanks, a few Tiger IIs and Panthers running on the last drops of gasoline at the head of a desperate column. They were going to act as a battering ram. They weren't fighting for the Führer anymore. They weren't fighting for the Reich. They were fighting for the bridge across the Elbe. The connection between Wenck's rescuers and Buss's trapped survivors was a fragile corridor through hell, and the Soviets were doing everything in their power to close it. On the night of April 29th, the breakout began. It was not a military maneuver in the traditional sense. It was a stampede of desperation, driven by the primal instinct to survive. In the darkness of the Halbe forest, 40,000 German soldiers and civilians formed a massive, chaotic wedge. At the tip of this spear were the last heavy tanks of the SS Panzer Division Frundsberg and the Heavy Tank Battalion 502. These steel giants, the King Tigers and Panthers, had barely enough fuel to move, but they possessed enough firepower to punch a hole through the Soviet encirclement. Behind them came a mass of humanity, wounded men on carts, women clutching children, and infantrymen with hollow eyes trudging through the mud. As the column lurched forward, the Red Army unleashed hell. Marshal Konev, realizing that his prize was slipping away, directed every available artillery battery to fire blindly into the forest. The trees, which had offered concealment, turned into deadly shrapnel. The shelling was so intense that the forest floor caught fire, illuminating the night with an eerie, flickering orange glow. Inside the wandering cauldron, order disintegrated. Units mixed together, officers lost contact with their companies, and the distinction between soldier and civilian vanished. It was a singular organism moving west, absorbing losses that would have shattered a disciplined army, yet continuing to move simply because the alternative was death. The fighting that took place along the forest tracks was savage and intimate. T-34 seconds ambushed the column from the tree lines, firing at point-blank range. German infantry, armed with the last of their Panzerfausts, swarmed the Soviet tanks in suicidal counterattacks to keep the corridor open. In the village of Halbe itself, the streets were choked with the wreckage of burning vehicles and the bodies of the fallen. The King Tigers at the front of the column acted as battering rams, crushing barricades and blasting Soviet anti-tank guns apart, clearing the path meter by bloody meter. Heinrici, now sitting in forced exile miles away, could only watch the reports filter in. The plan he had orchestrated was working, but at a horrific cost. The Ninth Army was bleeding itself white to escape. For every kilometer they advanced toward Wenck's 12th Army, thousands were left behind. The route was marked not by signs, but by the burning hulks of equipment abandoned when they ran dry of fuel. It was the arithmetic of survival playing out in its cruelest form, sacrificing the rear guard to save the vanguard. Then, on the morning of May 1st, the miracle happened. The lead elements of the Ninth Army, battered and exhausted, broke through the last line of Soviet resistance near the village of Belitz. Across a small stretch of open ground, they saw the green flares rising into the morning sky. It was the signal from Wenck's 12th Army. The young soldiers of Wenck's division had held the corridor open against overwhelming odds, defying the Americans to their back and the Soviets to their front, just to offer a hand to their trapped comrades. The link-up was a scene of apocalyptic relief. Men who had been fighting without sleep for weeks collapsed into the arms of their rescuers. But there was no time for celebration. The corridor was narrow, unstable, and under constant fire. Wenck's army was not there to stay. They were there to escort the survivors into American captivity. The two armies, the rescuers and the rescued, turned their backs on Berlin and the ruined dream of the Reich, and began the final march toward the Elbe. They were leaving behind the ruins, the ideology, and the madness of their Führer. They were marching toward the only victory left to them: survival. By the first days of May, the banks of the Elbe River, near the town of Tangermunde, presented a scene that looked less like a military operation and more like a biblical exodus. The broken ruins of the railway bridge jutted out of the grey water like a severed limb. On the eastern bank, a mass of humanity, soldiers of the 9th and 12th Armies, mixed with terrified civilians, stretched as far as the eye could see. They were dirty, starving, and traumatized, but in their eyes, there was a frantic, burning hope. Across the water, they could see the olive-drab uniforms of the U.S. 102nd Infantry Division. They could see American trucks, American tanks, and most importantly, they could see a world where the gulags did not exist. The negotiations for the surrender were tense. General Wenck and General Buss crossed the river to meet with the American commanders. The Americans were stunned by what they saw. They had expected a fanatical Nazi army bent on fighting to the death. Instead, they found two German generals who were pleading not for their own lives, but for the permission to ferry their men and the refugees across the river before the Russians arrived. The American generals, bound by agreements with the Soviet Union, were technically not supposed to accept the surrender of troops fighting the Red Army, but faced with the sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster unfolding before them, the local commanders turned a blind eye to the politics. The order was given, let them cross. What followed was one of the most dramatic evacuations of the war. Since the bridge was destroyed, everything that floated was pressed into service. Barges, fishing boats, rafts made of oil drums and timber planks, even rubber tires were used to ferry the wounded and the women across. Those who couldn't find a place on a boat swam. Thousands of soldiers stripped off their uniforms, threw their weapons into the mud, and plunged into the icy current. The Elbe became a highway of survival. But the war was not quite over. As the ferrying operations reached their peak, the Soviet vanguard arrived at the rear of the pocket. Soviet tanks pulled up to the high ground overlooking the river and began firing directly into the crowds massed on the eastern bank. It was a final act of vengeance. Panic erupted. The orderly evacuation threatened to turn into a riot as people scrambled over each other to escape the shelling. The German rear guard, men who knew they would never make it across, stayed behind to man the last few anti-tank guns. They sacrificed themselves to buy their comrades another 10 minutes, another 5 minutes, another boatload. For Heinrici, who was now stripped of command and waiting for the end in a basement in Plön, this was the validation of his defiance. He had been called a coward by Keitel. He had been accused of sabotage by Hitler. But as he looked at the maps in his mind, he knew the truth. If he had obeyed orders, if he had defended the Seelow Heights to the last man, or if he had sent the Ninth Army to die in the ruins of Berlin, these tens of thousands of people crossing the Elbe would be dead. The poisoned dwarf had not won the battle for Germany that was impossible, but he had won the battle for the Germans. However, the mathematics of the crossing were brutal. The Americans could not take everyone. As the Soviet grip tightened, the perimeter on the eastern bank collapsed. The last boats pushed off, leaving thousands still stranded on the shore, their hands reaching out toward the west as the Red Army soldiers emerged from the smoke. The Iron Curtain was descending right there, in the middle of the river. For those who made it across, the war ended with a blanket and a ration tin. For those left behind, the war ended with a rifle butt and a march to Siberia. The difference between the two fates was the decision of one general to disobey his Führer. The silence that fell over Europe on May 8, 1945, was deafening. For Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, sitting in a British prisoner of war camp, the war was over. He had no army, no rank, and no country left to defend. To the Nazi loyalists, like Keitel and Jodl, he was a traitor who had refused to fight for the capital. To the Allies, he was just another German general who had served a criminal regime. But to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians who were sitting in temporary camps along the Elbe River, eating American rations instead of marching to a gulag, Heinrici was the only man who had mattered. The mathematics of his disobedience were staggering. By refusing to defend the Seelow Heights, according to Hitler's suicidal static doctrine, he had saved the Ninth Army from immediate vaporization on April 16th. By refusing to counterattack toward Berlin on April 20th, he had prevented the army from being fed into a pointless meat grinder. And by orchestrating the breakout to the west instead of the east, he had successfully engaged in the largest rescue operation of the war's final days. Historians estimate that between the withdrawal at Seelow and the breakout at Halbe, over 250,000 lives were saved from Soviet captivity or death. Heinrici was never tried for war crimes. He was a professional soldier who fought by the old rules, a man who famously refused to carry out the scorched earth decrees that ordered the destruction of German infrastructure. When he was released from captivity, he lived a quiet life, fading into obscurity until his death in 1971. He rarely spoke of the war, and he never sought glory, but his actions at Seelow Heights remain a masterclass in the difference between fanaticism and professionalism. The Battle of Seelow Heights proves a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. Courage cannot defeat physics, and tactics cannot defeat logistics. Germany lost the battle the moment the first Soviet artillery shell was fired. No general, no matter how brilliant, could have stopped Zhukov's steamroller, but a brilliant general could choose how to lose. Hitler and his sycophants chose to lose with a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods, where everyone dies for the sake of a symbol. Heinrici chose to lose with a strategy of preservation. In the end, The German general who withdrew his army 5 minutes before hell unleashed didn't just dodge artillery shells. He dodged the madness of his own leadership. He understood that armies are not made of flags or maps. They are made of fathers, sons, and husbands. The legacy of Seelow Heights is not the ground that was lost, but the humanity that was saved. It stands as a stark reminder that in the darkest moments of history, when the systems of power demand total sacrifice, the most courageous act a commander can perform is simply to say, no. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis of the Seelow Heights compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We dig deep into the forgotten decisions that shaped the history of warfare. What other battles do you want us to decode next? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.